Thanks, Asha. So the findings presented here today are from an online panel survey of just over 4,000 Australian participants aged 16 to 49 years. Participants, for those of you that are data geeks, and there probably aren't that many of you in the room, but they were recruited through a social research online panel provider and were invited to take part in a survey that examined sex, technology and relationships. And we asked them a range of different questions. We asked them about their own online dating and sexual selfie taking behaviours. We asked them about their attitudes towards sexual selfies and to the distribution or sharing of images. We also asked them a standard psychological distress scale, which is an acknowledged measure of depression and anxiety. We asked a range of different victimisation items and of course some demographics. And in our research to date, we've also interviewed a range of experts over the last few years around various aspects of both image-based abuse and technology-facilitated sexual violence. And that's included conversations with police, legal services, sexual and domestic violence support services, for example, to find out a bit more about what are people seeking assistance and help for and where might some of the gaps be. So I just wanted to acknowledge that some of the insights that we're sharing tonight are also informed by that broader program of research. Now, while the media this week has been interested in our overall finding that I'll talk about in a moment, I did want to take the opportunity to provide you with a little bit more of a detailed definition of what we asked our participants. So there were two key elements to the questions on victimisation that we designed. The first is that following the typology that Nicola's just explained, we did not just focus on the distribution of nude or sexual images. We included separate questions on whether a nude or sexual image was ever taken without a person's permission, whether it was sent to others or posted online, and whether threats were made to share or post the image. The second key element of the questions that we designed was that we asked a set of descriptive behavioural questions. And this is because we know from other research, many decades of research into harassment and violence, that if you just ask someone, for instance, have you ever been harassed? A certain number of people will say yes, that they've been harassed. But if you actually describe to them and ask them, have you experienced all these different sets of specific behaviours? Many more people will say, oh yeah, actually that's happened to me as well. And you get a much more accurate picture of the extent of that harassment. So we did not just ask whether someone had ever taken, distributed or threatened to distribute a nude or sexual image. We asked about a range of specific examples that you can see on the screen there. So overall, our survey found that 1 in 5 of our participants, or 23%, reported being a victim of at least one form of image-based abuse. Most common were sexual or nude images being taken of them without their consent, with 1 in 5 or 20% reporting that experience alone. This was followed by sexual or nude images being sent on to others or distributed without their consent, with 1 in 10 or 11% of those surveyed reporting those experiences. And finally, 9% of survey respondents said that they'd experienced threats for a nude or sexual image to be sent on or distributed to others without their consent. So importantly, our survey also found that there were some groups within the Australian community who were more likely than others to report to us that they'd ever been a victim of image-based abuse. So for example, 1 in 2 Indigenous Australians that responded to the survey reported that they'd been a victim. 1 in 2 Australians who also disclosed a disability. 1 in 3 lesbian, gay and bisexual Australians. 1 in 3 young people aged 16 to 19 years. And 1 in 4 of those aged 20 to 29. Now we're still conducting this research and we're still consulting with some of our key stakeholders in the community to more fully understand those victimisation rates among some of those more vulnerable populations. But one thing that I think is clear is that some of these findings reflect patterns of abuse and harassment in our community more broadly, where groups that experience inequality and discrimination within our community are also at greater risk of multiple forms of victimisation, and that includes online forms of harassment, bullying and abuse, and now we're finding it includes image-based abuse. But a really important finding that I also wanted to draw your attention to is that of those participants who had experienced what you might call sexting coercion, or in other words, where they'd been pressured into sending a sexual image that they didn't want to, 1 in 2 went on to report that they were a victim of at least one form of image-based abuse. Now, something that I think is really important to note here is that even among those people who told us that they had never sent, either consensually or under pressure, a sexual self-image, we found that 1 in 10 still said that they'd been a victim of at least one form of image-based abuse. Now, that might take a minute to kind of work out, hang on a minute, how could they have been a victim? But it reflects the finding that 1 in 5 had had an image taken without their consent in the first place. So while sending sexual selfies might increase the risk that those images are then misused, not sending sexual selfies is by no means a guarantee protection against image-based abuse victimisation. Our survey also found that victims of image-based abuse were almost twice as likely as non-victims to report experiencing high levels of psychological distress. Now, these impacts were highest for those victims who said that they'd experienced threats to distribute an image, of whom 80% reported high levels of psychological distress that are consistent with a diagnosis of moderate to severe depression or anxiety disorder. And I have been asked a lot this week to speculate around, well, why might it be that the threat is in fact more difficult or more harmful for people than even those who said that someone had in fact distributed their image? And I think partly it's easy to understand that having a threat looming over your head, not knowing whether it's going to happen or when it's going to happen or who might see them, is in of itself likely to cause a high level of anxiety and distress. But also what we suspect is there's an overlay here with patterns of abuse among ex-partners and partners, for instance, in domestic violence and stalking situations, which might be contributing to why the threat of distribution of the image has such a high level of psychological impact. We also found that, that many victims reported that they were very or extremely fearful for their safety as a result of the victimisation. Now, itself, feeling afraid for your safety is again an important indicator of potential stalking or potential domestic violence perpetration. And many legal definitions require not only that a course of conduct, for instance, is repeated, but that a victim fears for their safety. But we did also find that there were some important differences in the experience of image-based abuse by women as compared to men. So overall, our survey found that both men and women were equally likely to report ever having been a victim of image-based abuse. So it tells us that image-based abuse is not exclusively a gender-based form of violence. And I think this goes some way to acknowledge the diversity of victims that are affected by the sharing, taking, or threats to share of nude or sexual images. But there do appear to be some differences in the nature and impacts of image-based abuse according to gender. So a key finding was that while men and women reported equally being victims, men were much more likely to have voluntarily shared a nude or sexual images of themselves in the first place. So remember that sexual selfie question that I said we asked. In particular, we found that men were twice as likely as women to have sent a sexual selfie to someone that they only knew online. And they were also more likely than women to send a sexual selfie to someone that they had just met. Now, what these findings suggest is that women are more cautious than men about who they share a sexual image with, but importantly, that doesn't seem to make them any less likely to be a victim. So a further insight into the gendered nature of image-based abuse is that the majority of victims said that the perpetrator was male, with victims also reporting about a third of perpetrators were female and a further 13% either they didn't know because it was a stranger or it was a mixed peer group of both men and women. We also found that both men and women experienced most image-based abuse from known people, such as peers, friends, acquaintances, family members, but women were more likely than men to be victimised by an intimate partner or former partner. So these gendered patterns are not too dissimilar from what we see in other forms of violence and abuse more broadly, where both men and women are likely to experience abuse from, first and foremost, from male perpetrators, but also that women are more likely than men to experience it from a partner or intimate or ex-partner. We also found that women victims were more likely than men to report feeling afraid for their safety. So for example, for images taken without consent, 1 in 3 women victims reported fear for their safety as compared to 1 in 5 men. But overall, what I think the research is pointing to is the varied and complex nature of image-based abuse. So while some of that abuse might still be understood as the one-off harassing act by the jilted ex-lover, some of it is clearly associated with domestic violence and stalking situations, and other examples are occurring in a much wider sort of peer bullying and harassment context. But I think it's also important to sort of point out an obvious limitation to survey research such as this, which is that victims can only self-report their victimisation if they have become aware that a sexual or nude image of them was either taken or distributed without their consent. Now, one only has to scratch the surface of content shared online to identify that there are many more sites and platforms dedicated to sharing women's nude or sexual images without their consent than there are men's. And certainly identifying these sites and the way that they operate is an important avenue for future research. And as Nicola mentioned, we are working with the Office of the Children's E-Safety Commissioner at the moment on a project to examine these sites of distribution. And while we're not yet able to discuss any of the findings of that work, it certainly sheds further light on the gendered nature of image-based abuse, and in particular on the online subcultures of trading in nude and sexual images of women in particular. So where to from here? Addressing the harms of image-based abuse is going to require a combination of efforts. Certainly we need to work alongside social media and website providers to better detect and remove image-based abuse material. That's vital to improving the responses. We also think that there's scope to improve the legal protections in relation to image-based abuse. As Nicola mentioned, in Victoria and South Australia, there are specific laws that criminalise the distribution and the threat of distribution of an intimate image. But we don't see any consistency across states and territories, and nor is there a clear federal law that addresses this issue. Providing information and support for victims is another important area for reform. But I think what our survey research really highlights is that that information and support is going to need to take a range of different forms in order to be accessible for the diversity of victims that we're seeing represented in this research. So for example, is it in accessible formats and plain language formats for people with a range of different disabilities? Is it directed with information for younger people as opposed to perhaps information that might be needed for older people? How can it acknowledge and respond to victims who may have experienced a one-off example of image-based harassment and abuse as compared to someone who's in the middle of a domestic violence crisis situation of which the images are just one part? So any information and support that we provide to victims needs to be able to take account and provide an appropriate response for those different types of scenarios that we're seeing. Yet ultimately, whether nude or sexual images are being taken or shared by an intimate partner or ex-partner, or whether it's a friend, a family member or a stranger, at the end of the day, it's consent that lies at the heart of this problem. And unfortunately, many Australians participating in our survey did hold victim-blaming attitudes in response to image-based abuse. So for example, 70% of our survey participants agreed with the statement that people should know better than to take nude selfies in the first place, even if they never send them to anyone. In fact, we found overall that 1 in 2 men and 1 in 3 women held attitudes that either minimised the harms or blamed the victims of image-based abuse. So our survey certainly suggests that there's a need for greater community education on this issue to challenge some of those attitudes. Now, indeed, in our work, we've always maintained that telling victims not to take sexual images in the first place is not the best or fairest way to try and address this issue. We've likened such advice to telling women, for example, not to leave the house at night or not to go out drinking with their friends if they don't want to be sexually assaulted. And such advice is flawed on many fronts, but in the time that I have, I'm going to go over 3 of them. First, this advice misrepresents the risk. Sure, Sexual assaults do happen around nighttime venues and in public spaces, for example, but avoiding these spaces does not guarantee your safety. And in fact, we know many sexual assaults take place in the home and from known men, including intimate partners. So similarly, this issue, or the issue here is not that avoiding sending sexual selfies won't somewhat reduce your risk of being a victim. Our survey data would say it's going to reduce some of that risk. But it won't guarantee that you don't become a victim. And ultimately, what I want to propose is that it's a question of balance in how we approach the issue. So I don't think, for instance, that it's victim blaming to provide advice to people generally to be cautious and smart about who they send images to, or perhaps more particularly what those images contain, especially if it's identifying marks or information. But I think it is victim blaming when we seem to tell women in particular that the first and only course of action is to address this issue by them stopping from taking any images. If we're also not tackling the actions of perpetrators of image-based abuse, then we further risk adding to the shame, blaming and humiliation of victims. So the second issue with the advice is that telling people not to take sexual selfies in today's society is kind of like telling people not to date or engage in sexual relationships at all. Technology has become embedded in our day-to-day lives. It is also a huge part of how we communicate and negotiate sex. Sociologists have observed, for example, that visual communication, the taking and sharing of images generally in our life, is now a normal day-to-day part of how we communicate. We don't, for example, call our mothers once a week to tell them that yes, we've been eating nutritious meals. Instead, we send them a picture of select healthy examples of what we've eaten and we post them on Instagram. So I think it's okay that sexual communications have also become more visual. What's not okay is when those images are not treated with the consent of the person in them. So the third issue with the advice to victims to just not take or send selfies in the first place is that a lot of the mainstream messaging around so-called revenge porn or sexting gone wrong has been overtly gendered, and it's reinforced the sexual shaming of women in particular. It's not that we see sort of general advice being given about perhaps the harm that sexual selfies might sometimes result in. Instead, what we've tended to see is very specific advice directed at women and often young women. And it's worth examining that gender dimension just a little further. Because while our survey results do show similar overall patterns in the extent of image-based abuse victimisation for men and women, they also hint at the different gendered impacts. Now, to me, there is little doubt that much of the harms of image-based abuse lies in the shaming, blaming and humiliation that's directed at victims. Not just by the individual perpetrator, but by a community of peers, family or society at large. And there is little doubt that that shaming, blaming and humiliation is gendered. In short, we live in a society where nude or sexual images are not just embarrassing for women, they can be taken as evidence that she's somehow worth less as a woman or as a human being, that she's a slut, that she must be unintelligent, that she's less professionally competent, that she's less suited in a role of mother or neighbour or friend. So to say that the answer to this issue is a simple matter of not taking sexual selfies just reinforces that sexual shaming. Ultimately, if we didn't live in a society where women's worth as human beings was so intimately tied to their bodies and to their value as sexual objects, then there'd be almost no harm if a sexual image did happen to get out in the public domain. And that is the culture and trend that I think we really need to change. Thank you.